Welcome to Chainlink Research Reports, a new series featuring research across the Web3 industry and academic fields, with scholarship that expands our understanding of decentralized technologies. I'm Dr. Jason Anastasopoulos, a professor at the University of Georgia, and a researcher at Chainlink Labs. Chainlink Research Reports explores research on blockchain and smart contracts from the fields of computer science, mathematics, economics, philosophy, political science, and public policy. Today, we're hearing from Dr. Joshua Gans, a professor of strategic management from the University of Toronto, about his 2019 piece titled The Fine Print in Smart Contracts. The piece was one of the first published works in the management field that covers some of the early potential use cases for smart contracts and identifies legal and economics issues relevant to smart contract development. The work can be used to understand the framework from which management and social science scholarship view smart contracts and is illustrative of the progress made in the smart contract and Web3 industry since the publication of the 2019 preprint. Ideally, this work can be used to understand some of the basic legal and economic issues surrounding smart contracts and as a reference for legal scholars, economists, and others interested in learning more about the potential impacts of smart contract technology. Now, here's Dr. Joshua Gans presenting his 2019 paper, The Fine Print in Smart Contracts.
Thanks very much for having me today. Here today, I have a paper that I've written, The Fine Print in Smart Contracts, that I'm sure will be linked to here, that people can download. It came out of my work with the Creative Destruction Lab at the University of Toronto in our blockchain stream. So the way economists look at any new technology is they look at its progression over time and they try to reduce that technology to a reduction in the cost of something. So when you had semiconductors, you have this sort of curve in terms of the reduction in cost for semiconductors. And the issue is what is on the y-axis. And actually, when you think about it, what's on the y-axis is the cost of arithmetic. What semiconductors have been able to do by progressing is to dramatically reduce the cost of arithmetic. And that's all that computers really do. It's just that we can do a lot of arithmetic now, many orders of magnitude that could be achieved without a computer. And so you tend to therefore have more of the thing that you reduce the cost of being done. It wasn't surprising that some of the initial applications for computers were to compute things we were already computing by hand, such as artillery tables, or to use it in accounting. And then we started to get more sophisticated uses based on the fact that we could do a lot of arithmetic. We can now do new things that we weren't doing before, such as computer games or electronic mail or digital music or digital pictures, all versions of arithmetic. The latter set of them not really seen as traditional arithmetic problems until we have very cheap arithmetic to deal with them. And we played the same trick in a book that I wrote with Jay Agarwal and Avi Goldfarb called Prediction Machines, when we looked at the economics of artificial intelligence. And we asked the same question: is you take one of these new neural networks, deep learning, artificial intelligence algorithms, and you say, well, what does this look like to an economist? And what it looks like is a reduction in the cost of something. And that reductions are all occurring right at the moment in terms of that. And what is the cost of the thing being reduced? Well, it turns out that it's prediction. Artificial intelligence has had great strides in its applicability in recent years, but essentially AI algorithms, as they currently exist in all of their forms, are doing only one thing, and that is they're doing cheaper prediction. They're able to predict things more cheaply. And so you can use that to say, well, we're going to get a lot more prediction, and we're going to get prediction applied to different problems. So that's what it is. So the question we'd ask with respect to the blockchain is, what's it reducing the cost of? And the answer that myself and Christian Catalini, who's a professor at MIT and is now Chief Economist of the DM Association, was that it was reducing the cost of verification. Now, what are we, or potentially reducing that cost? What do we mean by that? Well, if you think about things at a transaction level, transactions have stages. They're born, the actions are performed on the basis of that transaction, and then in the future, some problem may arise. So you give birth to a transaction, it has certain attributes that it exists, who are the parties, timestamp, conflict resolution rules, consideration, so forth. Then people taking into account that agreement that was reached will perform certain actions, and they'll perform actions in expectation that other people to the agreement will also perform those actions. So that's the whole point of a contract. And then you have a problem that might arise because no contract is perfect. And in that case, when there's a problem or conflict, you have to go back and you have to say, well, what did we agree to? And who's in violation of it? And has people done what they said they'd do? And that's the process of verification. Now, prior to a blockchain, you generally have to do verification through an intermediary, some sort of audit, some sort of judicial process, etc. And this was costly. The potential of a blockchain is to make this costless by inscribing the attributes of the transaction on the blockchain, as well as the performance of any actions. You can make verification a cinch because all of those things are already embedded. And this is important because if you think about problems of manipulation of information, disagreements, and so forth, it's really that immutability of the blockchain that takes that out of the hands of people and makes it more reliable. And that's what really a reduction in the cost of verification is going to do. So just to give you an example, imagine you had a simple contract like this. Acme Corp agrees to pay Wile E. Coyote $100 to catch the Roadrunner by April 1st, 2019, and that's signed on the 1st of January, 2018. The Roadrunner is caught. Wile E. Coyote goes back to Acme Corp and says, this was our contract. You agreed to pay me $200, right? So you can see here that there are now a dispute. There's one contract and there's another contract. So how do you resolve that particular dispute? Which is the contract that was actually agreed upon, is going to be an important thing to be able to determine. This was already fine in the physical paper world. Maybe you'd each have a piece of paper and you'd have to match it up, although you can imagine situations where even that is imperfect. But it certainly was going to be a big issue in the digital realm where it's very easy to adjust some of the parameters involved. And just to tell you how easy it is, I mean, there was this article from a couple of years ago about somebody who was literally sending invoices to Google and Facebook. You'd think very sophisticated, technologically sophisticated companies, and invoicing them for stuff that there was never an agreement and never done, and then getting paid up to 121 million in total. Before getting caught. One suspects that could have done half that amount and not been caught. But the point is that at some level, Facebook and Google found it cheaper to pay out these invoices than to have internal checking procedures that verified that there was an agreement in place, that the thing had been performed, and that the payment was legitimate. So, if Facebook and Google can be subject to this, imagine the rest of the world. Now, our traditional way of thinking about smart contracts in this environment has been to say, well, how will we deal with this performance issue? Is we'll get everybody to place their money in up front, and then we'll encode that on the blockchain and the agreement's there, and there's some money being held in escrow. And so if things are done as appropriate, there'll be a payout, etc. Now, that's not perfect, but at least it ensures that somebody is going to have the money to pay for the thing should it arise. And these are some of the contracts we've seen initially, but that's smart in terms of contracts. What we want is a contract system that allows you to actually implement low verification costs so that everybody relies on the contracts and does what they're supposed to do. So this is just a form of bonding, as we call it in economics. It's sort of like an automated direct debit, and it relies on you being able to specify performance in a objective and codifiable way. So it's kind of limited. So how do you actually take contracting to the next level was the thing that I wanted to focus on in my paper. And this goes to the heart of an important issue, because when is a blockchain valuable? And we want to know that because if somebody comes to us, and we get a lot, with a startup idea, one of the chief questions for us is, why do you want to do this thing now? Why wasn't it done soon before? And the answer should be, well, because the blockchain didn't, that technology and that way of doing things didn't exist before. So you want to understand when the blockchain is actually going to add value. And what do we mean by add value? That it actually adds value to a contractual process to make it actually work. That's what's going to be required. So, this has been an issue that lots have struggled with. This is Vince Cerf tweeted this one. Do I need a blockchain? No. What he was basically responding to there was that, surely a lot of things that you can do on a blockchain, you can do without a blockchain. And of course, that is the correct answer to the correct question and the correct answer. But the question is, can we find that thing? Can we find that thing, smart contracting, that the blockchain can do that other things cannot do? And the paper I have is an optimistic view of that. I think it's possible. Lots of people try to come in more convoluted ways of thinking about the value of a blockchain, but I won't go into that here. I'd love to play you this Seinfeld clip, but I don't think it'll translate, and it'll probably cause this podcast to be pulled down. But basically, this is a Seinfeld clip where Newman and Kramer have agreed to an exchange. Newman's going to give Kramer a bicycle helmet, and Kramer's going to give Newman a radar detector for the car. And they can't quite trust each other. This is the right thing. And so Jerry ends up doing a simultaneous exchange where he plays the role of giving the objects to each of them because they were wanting to renege on the deal because they thought they might be getting a bad deal. But then, of course, at the end of this, it turns out that the radar detector doesn't work at all. Anyhow, so I can't show that, but you could look it up if you want to see it. The issue is, where the blockchain's coming in is through trust. If I do a smart contract, where is it going to provide the trust so that I can rely on the other party to do what they're going to do? So trust arises when there's an agent who can be reasonably certain that an obligation will be met. If you are certain someone will pay you, you'll do the service. If you are certain that somebody will do the service, you'll pay them. Those are the obligations. Without trust, you're left with other mechanisms. You're left with simultaneous exchange, which is what was happening in the Seinfeld example. Or we have to find a mechanism for trust. And that mechanism is going to be, that mechanism for trust is going to be finding trustworthy people and working out how you know that they're trustworthy people, having relationships with them because you're dealing with them repeatedly in an infinite game, or being able to access the contractual law system that is designed to allow trust to surface. But that's costly, which is, of course, where we come in here. And finally, do other people, you can develop a reputation for dealing well outside of your relationship that you can see. So these are all sorts of things we use. But the whole idea of the blockchain is we don't have to use any of that stuff. In other words, we want to be dealing without trust. And so we want to give meaning to obligations without trust. We have to resolve the timing issue. And we can't resolve the timing issue, who goes first, but we want to make it as if everybody was doing their obligations at the same time so that they can't back out of them or tweak them or anything like that. So the fundamental unit of understanding any of this stuff, and this is what we teach in our program, is the obligation. The question is, what can you do with the blockchain to improve obligations working? So obligations are created if some specific state arises, which might be some external event, or it might be because somebody else has performed their obligation. In order to create an obligation, those states of what has occurred that creates the obligation must be recorded. So that's where the blockchain is going to come in as a infrastructure to be able to record obligations, send a signal that it's recorded, and ensure that it's all working. Now, the problem is that the performance of those obligations has to be verified. Now, you can imagine situations where this gets coded in to external data, such as if I'm worried about the delivery of something, I queue into an API for FedEx and I can verify that delivery. But in other situations, it's going to be a problem, especially if you're talking about the quality of stuff. And my favorite examples of this are sort of international trade examples where people order stuff on the internet and they don't get what they thought they were going to get. And in these particular cases up here, they are fairly dramatic in that regard. I like the little rug that gets ordered and it turns out to be the size of the photo. So obviously this is the number one impediment to people engaging in trade and buying stuff over the internet still. And so you can analyze this through obligation, create, record, and verify. What are the obligations? One obligation is payment, that you pay the merchant. When you pay the merchant, that creates an order. It's recorded by the sending of money, and you can verify that with a bank statement. When you deliver, that's an obligation. Once someone's paid, you have an obligation to send the thing to them. You can record that with a message, and you can verify it with a carrier receipt. And then the final one is the quality, that I get what I thought what we mutually expected this transaction was about. That's created through the delivery. There's another message there, but the verification in the traditional way is done through the court. Now, as it turns out, if we ran this as a smart contract on the blockchain, all of this would be exactly the same, but for that bottom right-hand corner. As you watch here, the blockchain's way, that triggers a change in that. I mean, we can do the payment over the blockchain as well. There's not a critical part there. But you have a mechanism that has to substitute for the court, basically has to automate what a court could do. Given that you're actually involving real humans in this transaction, and it's humans' perceptions of what has occurred that is driving everything. So that is often regarded as a last mile problem or something that cannot be easily solved by the blockchain. But in my paper, I argue, yes, it can, because you can take a mechanism, which is basically a set of incentives coded onto the blockchain that can make at least this international trade example work out. So you have to tie the performance to the reward, and you have to have some other things to generate trust. And we get our teams to actually fill in a canvas to work out all that stuff. But the key innovation is the mechanism. And a mechanism, you see this in the Bible. King Solomon employed a mechanism when there was a dispute over whose baby this poor kid was. And his mechanism was to propose splitting the baby into two to reveal who the true mother is. It's not a very good mechanism. It doesn't actually work, but it's an example of a mechanism. So you want this to work through the fact that you've got humans. And so in my paper, I go through some examples of that I won't spend time on now because it takes a little more detail. But basically, it was invented by two Nobel Prize winners in economics, Eric Maskin and Jean Tirole. They didn't win a Nobel Prize for this. This happens to be just some other thing that they did. But it involves a game that has an announcement stage and a challenge stage. And broadly speaking, what it is a slightly more complicated automated return policy. And that can actually do the trick of getting the quality issue resolved in international trade. So the surprising thing is that this works, and the paper goes through this in detail, and this is what the game looks like for anybody who's interested in such things. Again, this is in the game in the paper as well. And so you can think about innovative mechanisms, and there've been a lot proposed in the blockchain community. And so I'm just suggesting yet another one that's particularly attuned to the international trade example. So in summary, the value of the blockchain is in improving the safety of transactions in a market. and lots of problems that can cause those transactions to be unsafe. But the blockchain, because it allows commitments to be based on codified or automated contracts, can provide a process by which mechanisms can be agreed upon and implemented at the same time. That actually allows us to, if we do it thoughtfully enough, deal with the human element as well. And I think this will be an interesting potential way that this space could develop. And for anybody else interested, at the Creative Destruction Lab, if you have a startup in the blockchain space, every year we run a cohort and would like to hear from you. And that's that.
Thanks, Joshua. That was a really fascinating presentation, and that was an excellent paper. I really enjoyed reading it, and actually thinking a lot about some of the things that you discuss in the paper, some of the aspects of smart contracts and how they're going to kind of revolutionize trade in the future. And so some of the questions that I have for you are related to some of those kind of bigger picture questions that you raise in the paper, but didn't really go into detail in. And one of the first ones, that you mentioned is the importance of reputation in smart contracts.
Right.
And of course, reputation being an important kind of identifier for the party that you're contracting with, to know whether you should actually contract with them via this mechanism. So one question I had regarding reputation was, how do you think reputation, or if you've thought about this already, should be incorporated into smart contract design? Do you think there's a kind of standardized score that individuals should be assigned, or what were you do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Well, I mean, reputation mechanisms are complicated. We all know the problems with, 5-star rating systems, and
Right.
the issue is sort of how they get used. And if you've a place like Uber, if you fall too far below the getting 5 stars every time, they trigger all sorts of terrible things for you, which of course leads to all sorts of pressures to always give a 5-star rating. Teaching ratings that I am subject to all the time, people can give you a 1-star rating, and normally you'd look at a 1-star rating and say, well, I guess this person thinks I should be fired. Now, I don't know if they think I should be fired. Fortunately for me, the university doesn't think I should be fired for a 1-star rating, and doesn't trigger an investigation. So it's all a matter of those thresholds, and that's even when you have a single-dimensional rating system. Obviously, we have other things where people have ratings, and there are reviews, and you can read why they gave the ratings they did, and all of those sorts of things. But of course, as soon as you go down that route, it's harder to quantify all this, quantify what a good rating is. I suspect that, if my little international trade thing took off, what you could use is compliance, lack of disputes, as something that would be a reputation builder. But then again, I want to be cautious on that, because the whole point of that mechanism is you don't have to rely on reputation. You can rely on the mechanism. As soon as we start tacking on reputation to it, it distorts incentives.
Right.
You see. So it's quite a complicated matter. I mean, the best version of the blockchain for reputation is, it, like cryptocurrency itself, is a way of recording somebody giving you some approval of some description, and you not being able to manipulate that. So it's basically a security element. Not that I don't see eBay or Uber or anything saying we needed a blockchain for this. I think they're fine with what they have. So I'm not sure how far we can go with that.
The idea of designing mechanisms, I mean, this is a part of your paper I really enjoyed, mechanisms to ensure that smart contracts are viable and that both of the parties kind of comply. And things like verification are easy, which of course is the whole purpose of this endeavor, right? But again, as like a political scientist, the first thing that comes to mind is, with although I understand mechanism design in economics is supposed to apply to the kind of rational agent, which is universal across cultures and things like that. But in kind of reality, I wonder if the in reality we have different cultures and people in different countries who have different ways of responding to incentives. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were on the effect that cultural practices and the way that people respond to incentives might have on the way in which mechanisms are created. In other words, do you think that maybe, and I don't know if this is an area of research and mechanism design as of now, but do you think that mechanisms might have to be tailored in some way to people who are transacting within a certain country, or or do you think that
no. So
are really important considerations?
yeah, no, I don't think so. There's two elements to that. One is that mechanisms require some calculation, thought, etc., and people aren't perfect. So will they work with less perfect people? At least for the mechanism I proposed there's been some experimental economics that actually have shown that in the context I was talking about, that it worked. Slightly more complicated context, not. So so there is that that gives some comfort. But in terms of culture itself is a trust mechanism. It's a way of setting expectations of part of a social contract. So it's what you think is going to happen and how you think people are going to behave. In a sense, it's performing a trust role already. So we are again talking about situations where people across cultures are dealing with one another. And where they cannot rely upon those sorts of norms and other things and expectations to work in terms of who they're dealing with. And so again, the raw cultural agnosticism of a mechanism is actually its virtue in that environment. It says, we think you care about money and we think you care about these three things and not much else. And so, so long as that's the case, this is going to get you a good outcome. Will that limit how far that it could be applied to? Absolutely. But I wonder still if there's some big gains to be had for contracts that exist in still rather transparent and simplified environments.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. I very much appreciate your time, Joshua and Jason, for joining us with your questions as well. Thank you very much. I'm going to take over from here and say goodbye to our audience, but I very much appreciate your time, both.
Thanks so much, Joshua.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. That is Chainlink Research Reports with Dr. Joshua Gans. Thanks so much to him. You can find his work and his homepage down below in the YouTube description. As always, you can follow, like, and subscribe to this YouTube channel. We do research reports every couple of weeks, as well as a number of other video series digging into the Chainlink and DeFi ecosystem. Thank you for your time, and we will see you guys next time.